What's up guys, it's Jan for Chess24. In this video we will cover the game of the day from the first day of action at the World Rapid Championship. One of my favorite events of the year just started in Almaty in Kazakhstan. And as game of the day, I've chosen the encounter between the reigning classical world champion Magnus Carlsen and the reigning rapid world champion Nodirbek Abdusattorov. You've probably heard of both these guys. Abdusattorov, one of the up-and-coming youngsters. Not only did he win the Rapid Championship last year, he also led his Uzbek team to an Olympic gold medal in the year 2022. Keeps improving, and both these players meet in the fourth round after they won their first three games. So both on 3 out of 3. Big clash for obvious reasons. And we see the world champion in classical chess starting with the humble-looking move 1b3 that, of course, has caught a lot of attention recently thanks to the efforts of players like Yobava and also because of the Adiban Chessable course. 1b3 is getting endorsed by the world champion himself now. Abdusattorov goes for the most principled move, pawn to e5, occupying the center. Carlsen plays bishop b2, attacking that pawn. Abdusattorov covers it, and white plays e3, very typical, keeping his options open if he wants to bring the bishop out, bring the knight out, see how black reacts. And recently, most top players have preferred the move knight to f6 here, compared to the other main option, which is pawn to d5, after which play can get very sharp. My favorite line being after bishop b5, black could go for the move knight ge7, far from the only move, but fun little gambit line there. Bishop takes e5, a6, takes, knight takes, bishop g3, h5, and we've seen serious players do that with black recently, but not today. Abdusattorov plays the move knight to f6. The main intention is that if white wants to go bishop b5 here, then this knight is not yet pinned, and black has been doing quite well in practice with the move bishop to d6, intending to play short castles, followed by rook to e8. Magnus doesn't want to debate this line, and he plays another move, knight to f3, hitting the pawn on e5 directly instead of indirectly via bishop b5, which we've seen quite a bit in practice as well. And usually players from the black side have reacted with pawn to e4 here, to which the knight typically goes to the center. Now black has a choice. The move I always thought was most principled is bishop to c5, allowing this doubling of pawns, but after this black gets a lot of activity. White does have other options though. Knight to f5 is a fun little line. Pawn to d3 is possible. So I would have been curious what Magnus has up his sleeve here. But instead, in the game, Abdusattorov decided to play similarly to the bishop b5 lines and went bishop to d6, covering the pawn. Which, the good news is it does cover the pawn. Bad news is it looks a little clumsy. You're blocking your own d-pawn, slowing down your development. Black typically wants to follow up with castles, rook e8, and then move the bishop back out of the way. But it does feel a tad slow here, where white has not yet committed to bishop to b5, like in the other line. White is a choice now. To my mind, pawn to d4 looks like a very principled move, and I would have been curious to see what Abdusattorov wants to do there. I guess black takes, let's say castles, bishop to e2, and Magnus maybe felt this wasn't quite enough, the structure a little too symmetrical after something like knight to e7. Looks a little more pleasant for white, but not what the world champion wanted. Instead he plays pawn to c4, going for a more Sicilian type setup, and in particular we'll see in the game he has something specific in mind, which is the so-called Scheveningen setup. Pawn to d3, knight goes here, bishop goes here, pawn goes to a3, and white has a very flexible formation, covering a lot of squares. Can't decide where he wants to take the action later. Black plays rook to e8. Once again, this is the maneuver that he wants to go for. And Carlsen goes a3, saying, do you think b4 is a threat? If so, then please stop it by a5 and commit to this. Abdusattorov obliges, goes a5. Now development continues. Bishop to e2. The bishop has to get out of the way, as expected. Short castles. And black plays d5. I wasn't sure about d5. I thought there's something to be said, especially with this knight not having committed to any square yet, to keep the structure a little more fluid. Play a move like pawn to d6, and if white goes, let's say knight bd2, to maybe start fianchettoing one of our bishops, either g6, bishop g7, or even b6, bishop b7, when there is all to play for. Maybe white is a little more comfortable because his formation is somewhat more flexible, but black does seem to have a solid position with decent pieces everywhere. So I think this d6 came into consideration very seriously. Abdusattorov plays more classically, plays pawn to d5. And after that, we get a very clean Sicilian, open Sicilian with colors reversed, where white, of course, because he has the extra tempo, and because black moved the bishop a couple times, does have a bit of a head start, but black still has a very, very sound formation. The knight now goes to d2, allowing this bishop and the knight to keep an eye on the e5 pawn, can potentially jump to c4 or to e4, as we'll see in the game. Black fortifies his e5 pawn by playing f6. Carlsen plays more typical Sicilian moves, plays queen to c2, getting the queen out of the way, connecting the rooks. And Abdusattorov plays a somewhat strange looking but strong move, plays bishop to f5, making sure for starters this pawn does move immediately. It looks a little strange at first sight because white has the option to go pawn to e4, targeting two pieces. But of course this was not missed. Black has knight to f4, counterattacking against the bishop on e2. And all white will really have done is weaken his own position. So of course Carlsen doesn't do that. Instead he plays rook f to e1, defending that bishop. So now pawn to e4 becomes a threat. And Abdusattorov sidesteps by going bishop to g6. So the bishop doesn't get hit. Now this position is where we may be in for the first real surprise of the game, if we're not counting 1b3. A standard Sicilian move would be something like rook a to c1, and then continue a slow build-up depending on what black wants to do. But Carlsen has very different intentions. He goes for a move that might shock you. He goes for the move pawn to g4. This wasn't a complete shock to me because the position is very reminiscent of a great classical game we know. Magnus Carlsen, big student of the classics, and also likes to honor them by playing in a similar way. And the game that came to mind was the game between Robert James Fischer and Ulf Andersson, where in this position, Fischer came up with a plan that I'm not sure was heard of or seen at the time. So he played king to h1, queen to d7, rook to g1, rook d8, knight e4, queen f7, and pawn to g4, and went on to win a nice game by launching an attack on the king side. Now knowing this predecessor, the move pawn to g4, comes as less as a shocker, but Carlsen still does it very early without even having prepared it with king h1 and rook to g1. But he wants a slow build-up, he wants to control the f5 square, put the knight here, then go king h1, rook g1, and then see if he can break through on the king side with knight h4 or maybe a well-timed pawn to g5. Goes without saying, this is a double-edged plan, as you can see. The computer is not exactly in love with it, but white does a very clear strategic agenda. And it's interesting to see Magnus Carlsen following in the footsteps of Robert James Fischer here with a move pawn to g4. Abdusattorov reacts in a natural manner, queen to d7. The computer points out a very computerish idea, the move pawn to a4. The point being that if white plays the most natural pawn to b4, sidestepping, that now black can sacrifice a piece here. Knight takes b4, a takes b, knight takes b4, and gain, according to the comp, a lot of counterplay after, let's say, check. Bishop f7, queen c3, knight to d5. This pawn starts running. The computer is happy with the black position, but not a real surprise that this was not played in a practical game. Queen e7 looks natural enough, hits the pawn on g4. Carlsen defends it with a little nuance. He goes king to h1, saying, okay, you can take it, but it's no longer check. And if you do, I will take on e5. Attack your queen. And then grab this bishop positional advantage. So Abdusattorov should not take the pawn. Once again, the computer likes his a4 move, but Abdusattorov plays rook a to d8, slowing down a little bit, allowing Carlsen to work further on his setup. He starts with knight to e4. Nothing wrong with the move rook g1 either. Carlsen puts the knight here, where he feels it belongs, blocking this bishop. And black plays another very natural move, king to h8, putting his king into the corner, so nothing bad can happen to him on this diagonal. This is an interesting moment where you would expect white to play rook to g1, but the world champion doesn't. And Peter Leko, during the live commentary, expertly predicted that Magnus wouldn't play rook g1, but instead a move like rook a d1, which he played indeed. And the reason is that now maybe Magnus was aware of this knight b4 counterplay. After rook g1, indeed, knight d4, a piece sacrifice. Giving an entire piece was a very, very strong option for black, securing counterplay by breaking up the center here, even though black would only get 2 pawns for the piece after, let's say, queen c1. Takes, knight somewhere. Black position would become very active, and without the light squared bishop, this king after white went g4 looks a little weakened. So, great example for what we call this prophylactic thinking by the world champion. Playing rook a1, which looks passive, but makes sure that black doesn't have this counterplay. And the black position without direct counterplay is also not exactly easy to handle. All the pieces are well placed, but you don't just want to sit there and wait for white to keep building on the king side. Rook g1, rook g3, knight h4, and then wait for the right moment to break with g5. So it's far from easy to play this with black, no matter what the computer thinks. Although even the computer now thinks that white is in fairly decent shape, as you can see by the engine bar. So rook g1 played, and Abdusattorov finds a strong human idea. He goes knight to b6, opening up this bishop, which he just put there, to create counterplay against his pawn on b3, either by attacking directly or maybe also by going a4. And if white were to go b4, the bishop could come to b3, pick up an exchange. So, well played by the reigning rapid world champion. Carlsen continues with his plan. There's no direct breakthrough on the king side yet, so he has to bring some reinforcements. Plays rook to g3. Abdusattorov doesn't waste time, plays excellently as well, goes pawn to a4, trying to undermine the white structure here. And white doesn't really have a choice. He would like to play b4, but that loses the exchange to bishop to b3. So Carlsen has to take the pawn, goes b takes a. And Abdusattorov keeps playing well, knight to a5. Threatening bishop b3, but also keeping an eye on the a4 pawn, which of course he would like to reclaim. Carlsen plays the most natural move, goes rook d to g1, building up on the king side. Computer is not in love with this move. Computer wanted more violent measures here. Wanted pawn to g5, trying to break up the black construction immediately. Saying bishop b3, don't impress me much. You can have this exchange, and I'll have good compensation. It's very hard to picture anybody playing like this. So Carlsen does keep his rook, goes rook dg1. And here Abdusattorov plays a natural move, but one that was maybe a little slow, giving Carlsen the momentum he needed to continue his attack. He goes bishop to d5, putting the bishop on this long diagonal, potentially pinning some of the knights, but not creating any direct threat. Black should have played knight takes a4, just reclaiming this pawn, hitting the bishop on b2. And it turns out white doesn't have any direct way to break through. If he prefers to keep his bishop, this bishop will still get exchanged after knight b3. The bishop doesn't have any squares left on the long diagonal. So black is in pretty good shape. And if white goes for broke here, let's say pawn to g5, then the position becomes a total mess after pawn to f5. But once again, it looks like black is in pretty good shape. For example, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop takes e5, f takes e4, d takes e4. Black would have 2 pieces against, I can't count, a rook and 2 pawns. Those pieces are active enough to At least keep the balance, if not, give him a somewhat better position with knight to c5. So it would have been curious to see what follow-up Carlsen had in mind after knight takes a4. Maybe just want to play g5, f5 and now retreat the knight. But it's hard to believe black can be in any trouble if he gets rid of this attacking bishop. So this is the key moment where maybe after Carlsen's human but slightly slow rook to g1, Abdusattorov should have kept his foot on the gas with knight takes a4. Instead, he goes for bishop d5. And now Carlsen doesn't waste any time trying to defend this pawn, which was a reasonable move as well, but instead goes for a softening of the black king side with pawn to g5. Threatening g takes f6, and black doesn't really have much choice. He has to go pawn to f5. Try to keep the g file closed for now. See how white reacts. Carlsen plays the most natural move, knight to c3. But another idea that Peter Leko mentioned in the live show that would have been tremendously strong was to sacrifice a whole piece here, just trying to get that g file opened. With knight to f6. Black has to take, pawn takes, and these rooks, which were somewhat mysteriously ganging up on the g file, would have had a very clear view towards the black king. I'm sure Carlsen considered this, but he probably quit after queen c6, offering exchange of queens, which looks like it does hold the balance for black. But after queen b1, it turns out that the white attack, even with the queen out of the way, is still tremendously strong. And if we keep clicking the button, we get some amazing variations, like queen takes f6, pawn to e4, breaking this pin, and also asking the bishop to please leave this diagonal to allow rook g8 checkmate. The bishop stays on it with bishop f7. Then the trouble comes in the middle of the board after knight takes e5. Rook takes e5. And once again, these are very computer variations. White wins in the end. f4, queen takes f4, and rook f1. The black position does collapse. There are too many loose ends trying to tie up, and the queen can't keep contact to the e5 rook after rook f1. Once again, fantasy variations, but goes to show what strength this white slow burn attack has. Carlsen, also in a way typical for him. He likes attacking, but he doesn't like sacrificing. And if he has a way to continue the attack without sacrifices, he prefers that, as he does here with knight to c3. Abdusattorov keeps his bishop on the long diagonal, bishop c6. He could have put the bishop here as well, trying to chase down this pawn again. But after queen somewhere, queen to c1, the white attack is still very serious because g6 is coming. And it wouldn't have been easy to keep things closed on the king side as well. g6, h6, always a big concession, allowing potential tricks like knight g5. We'll see something similar in the game. So Abdusattorov goes bishop c6, keeping this bishop more actively. Carlsen decides he has to block it off with pawn to e4 to break this pin. Knight takes a4. Black finally reclaims his pawn. Knight takes, bishop takes, and queen to c3. Looks like black is doing all right. But white still keeps some momentum. And here, after knight c6, this knight was attacked. Carlsen does not waste any more time. Goes for the attack with pawn to g6. Putting black in a tough spot. Maybe he had intended to play h6, but that is met with the very strong resource, knight to g5. Threatening a check on f7, which is very awkward to parry. And taking it would run into some serious turbulence. For example, rook h3 check, king g8, rook takes g5, and the white attack will be very, very hard to stop. The computer actually gives white a decisive edge here already. Because of the threat of rook h5, there's also the resource of queen c4 check when it's needed. E takes f5 is there. The black defense just does not quite hold here, and white would win. So h6 does not keep black out of danger. Instead, Abdusattorov, who's been playing reasonably quickly so far. One reason he's such a fantastic rapid player is that He does make good moves fairly quickly, kept the pace here, and found the most tenacious option. Knight to d4. Asking Carlsen to maybe go for some exchanges, relieve the position a bit. And if the world champion were to take here after knight d4, e4, all of a sudden it's black who's in charge. Because the white center crumbles. However, that's not what Magnus Carlsen had in mind, and he plays maybe the star move of this game in this position, disregarding the attack on the bishop on e2. He goes for the only move that gives white an advantage. Knight to g5, tremendously strong. Actually a rook sacrifice, because after knight takes e2, there's a double attack on the queen and the rook. But it turns out that this bishop was very poisoned. Abdusattorov takes it. But maybe his best chance was to go rook to e7. Not a very human move. Letting this bishop live and trying to stabilize his kingside as well as he can by covering this square with the rook. Still, white would be better. He would keep his bishop, go bishop h5, and then go knight f7 check when he pleases. But after knight takes e2, white has a fantastic continuation that Carlsen actually misses. Carlsen had something in mind, and he plays something good here, but he had an even stronger move. And that move is queen to c4. Just saying, you know what? Be my guest. Take that rook. My threat of knight f7, followed by knight h6 and queen g8. Checkmate. Is too strong. And what I believe Magnus might have missed is after knight takes g3, rook g3. I'm sure he considered this. The only black move to cover the knight f7 threat is rook to e7. And looks like there's no real way forward for white, who is, after all, the whole rook down. But the very counterintuitive move g takes h7 here just wins the game on the spot, because the black pieces are so clumsy that there's no way to stop queen g8 checkmate. So you usually don't consider gh7, because in almost every position this pawn is just blocking white's attack and standing in the way of checkmating the king. So to see gh7 creating an unstoppable threat of queen g8 checkmate is fairly rare. This was the way to win the game. You can check for yourself. There was no other way to defend against a threat either. hg runs into rook h3 checkmate. And if, let's say, h6, then white carries out this typical smothered mate approach here. Queen g8 is made directly. We don't even need to sacrifice the queen. So Carlsen misses that chance, but fortunately for him, the alternative that he goes for is pretty good as well. He starts with knight f7 check. And his point is that if now king to g8, now he can play queen to c4. Let's say takes, rook takes, and he would have eliminated this rook e7 defense that I showed earlier. Somewhat surprisingly, black still doesn't have a way to defend this position. For example, queen to e6, g takes h7, and this queen is either being lost after king h7, knight g5, or new queen will be built after king f7, h8 queen. So that's what the world champion had in mind when going knight f7 check, and Abdusattorov, of course, sees through that and decides his best chance. So take that knight, queen takes f7, g takes f7. After all, the white queen is hanging as well. But now, once the dust settles, after f takes e8, bishop takes e8, bishop takes d3, we can see that white managed to take a little more stuff and is in exchange up with a favorable position. Where black does have bishops and a pawn, but the white attack is still looming. This pawn being under attack, the rooks still menacingly placed on the g file. And this position is very hard to hold in practice, and maybe also in theory. Computer does some magic here to not make it easy, like bishop to c6 with the point of bishop takes e5, rook takes d3. Rook takes d3, bishop takes e4. And Carlsen would still have had to work for converting his advantage. But in the game, Abdusattorov goes down without much of a struggle. After bishop g6, the white position just becomes overwhelming. E takes f5, bishop takes f5, bishop takes e5. Once again, hitting g7 and c7. If black tried to cover everything with rook d7, white has a bunch of options, but he could go, for example, pawn to d4, saving this pawn, defending this pawn. And he would have had to work a bit, but it is very likely he would have converted his extra exchange here. Instead, Abdusattorov chooses a more abrupt ending, goes bishop takes d3, hoping for white to go bishop takes g7, to which all of a sudden this check would turn the tables and black would win. But of course, Carlsen doesn't allow that, and instead he goes for a brutal finish, taking on g7 with the rook. And there's no defense. If black takes, the bishop takes. Bishop f6 check. It's a nasty discovered check. So rook falls and bishop e4 check, rook g2. Does win back in exchange, but white would still emerge a piece up. So that didn't really help. Other than that, there's not much to do. Rook g8 checkmate is threatened. If we give this check now, this rook not only parries the check, but also gives a check of its own, or the bishop gives a check technically. And white wins, bishop g7, bishop takes, game over. So Abdusattorov decides to resign after that move. Rook takes g7, and yeah, what a game by the world champion Magnus Carlsen, who moves to 4 out of 4 with the help of the move 1b3 and some risky but highly instructive strategy as well. Of course, the engine pointed out some improvements, but overall, very impressive game, impressive strategy, and also pretty cute rook sacrifice in this position after knight d4, knight to g5. Defeating the defending champion Nodirbek Abdusattorov, who's still very much in the running, of course. But Magnus Carlsen looking sharp. 5 rounds of the World Rapid and Blitz, the World Rapid, have been played at the time of recording. 8 more are to come. There's still 8 to play for. Currently, the world champion is in the shared lead with some other players, featuring Arjun Erigaisi and I believe our friend Jordan van Voorhees. But a lot of action is still to come. Thank you so much for watching this little video. If you have become a fan of the move pawn to b3 on the first move, of course, you can check out our friend Adi Ban's course on Chessable, where he gives you complete 1b3 repertoire. Thanks for watching. See you in the next game of the day. Until then, bye.